Well, welcome to our podcast here at Gateway Church. We are in the middle of our Flourishing series, and today we are talking about how to flourish financially. And I am pleased to say that we've got Aman Quadri and Mark Fantacone, some of our South buddies. Love you guys. And you guys are a part of this community, have been a part of this community for years and years, but also you help people and you are in the industry of either helping people build wealth, building that for your family, and passing on that legacy. So Mark, I wanted to start with you. What got you interested when it comes to finances and building wealth? How did that start?
Well, after I graduated college and I started my career, I went into debt immediately. I bought a full ski package, and because I had money. I didn't have money when I was in college.
Right.
And I got in debt. And it's like, wait a minute, now what do I do? It took me 6 months to dig out of that hole. And I said, I'm never doing this again. And then I just started getting interested in the stock market, how to budget, how to avoid debt, how to build wealth. And it enabled me to retire at a pretty early age from technology. And now I do what I'm passionate about.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And Aman, I know you've had a plethora of different careers. We talked about that a little bit. How did you get started in building wealth as coming from a physical therapy background? Some people might be listening saying, well, I'm not in finances, so that's not me. How could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I was young, and in high school, college, I started a little small computer store, and so I had to learn how to budget quickly, right? You know, you have to deal with expenses and all that stuff, and I found that even, like Mark was saying, I fell into debt. And so it was digging out of that debt and then trying to do the same thing. Was like, I'm not going to be back in it again. And I grew up in a family where we didn't talk about that, right? We didn't talk about finances. We didn't talk about, how to save or anything like that. It was just, eat, live, and go do your thing. And so for me, it was as I went through the computer store and then went back to school for therapy and then got out of it and went into different careers in health tech and emerging tech. And now I work in the fintech space, which is building financial products that are focused on getting people out of generational debt to generational wealth. And that's my passion.
I love that. I love that. Generational debt to generational wealth.
Well, that's what we live, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everything we do is trying to get us deeper and deeper into the hole. And how do we stop people from starting altogether, or the little tools to get you out of it faster,
yeah,
right?
That's good. And I love that, especially, it's no secret we're a church, right? And sometimes that can vacillate between prosperity gospel, and God wants you to be have all this money and have all this health and all this wealth too. Then the other side, unfortunately, is like, well, I'm just not going to work hard to save because God's going to provide. He knows my needs, right? Yeah. So when it comes to financial flourishing, what are some simple ways to define that where the pendulum doesn't swing to either of those sides? How would you describe financial flourishing? I want to start with you, Mark.
Well, I would say it's where you don't have to worry about money anymore. You have enough to cover your needs, and you have flexibility. You have flexibility to do what you're passionate about. You have flexibility to give more. You have flexibility to invest in whatever you're passionate about, and there's no anxiety about money. It's just freedom and peace.
Yeah, that's good. What about you, Man?
I think financially flourishing to me is more about trying to figure out how, again, like you said, let me add to that, is like getting rid of the anxiety part, but also to be able to understand that what we make here is of course we want to take care of our families, but we also want to be able to do the things that we love and give back and take care of the next generation, right? I think that right now, like, for me, I've always focused on like, how do we get my wife and I in a good spot? And then once we started having kids, how do we get them in a good spot, right? And so we've started from day one trying to teach them, like, how do you buy stocks? How do you do research? How do you find the right apps to use? Because they're in a world now where everywhere they go, they spend. And so to me, I tell them, it's like, budget wisely, build your wealth slowly, and then continue to do it habitually. And if you do those things, you will be in a spot where you don't worry.
That's good.
Yeah.
You both mentioned anxiety. I'm sure there's people that are listening that are saying, well, you don't know my story. I'm in $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 of debt, whether that's consumer, student loans. how can somebody stave off in this road of like building wealth and trying to get out of generational debt and building wealth and flourishing financially? Sometimes the anxiety is just, it feels like it's nonstop, right? It feels like I can't do any more to get out of this, or I can't, I need to do more to compare to my neighbor down the street or my coworker who seems like they're bursting out of the seams. So how would you help somebody who's listening, and maybe a story that might connect, of not letting the pursuit of wealth become the means to destroy other parts of their life, of flourishing in other parts of their lives? What I mean by that is sometimes the pursuit of wealth can infringe upon your family and the time you spend with your family, or your mental health, or you are at work all the time. You're not taking care of yourself physically. So what are some guardrails that people can put up to maybe stave off some of that anxiety and stave off some of the erosion of some of the other areas of their life? What are some guardrails around building wealth as they pursue that in a healthy way? Aman, do you want to answer that?
I'm going to say the first thing that I think both of us could agree on is you got to start with the budget in mind, right? I think that if you don't start there, then you will definitely go off the rails very quickly, right? So you have to understand what you make. You have to understand what you can save. You have to understand what you can give. And then you have to understand your nature too, right? So I've had a numerous amount of job opportunities in the past. Some are very lucrative and some not so much. And I have turned down jobs where I could make 2 or 3 times as much, because most of those jobs would have required an excessive amount of time away from family, an excessive amount of time away from my wife, and an excessive amount of time focused on business development, making sales, doing whatever. And all those things are a division not only between myself and my family, but also between myself and God, right? And to me, I always go back to the parable of the young ruler, right?
Yeah.
You find it in a couple spots, Matthew, Mark, where he shows up and asks like, hey, what can I do to get eternal life? And and Jesus says, all right, you need to follow the commandments. He's like, well, which ones? And he's like, well, pretty much all of them, right? Don't kill, don't steal, don't do adultery, and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, I got one more for you, because he asked, what am I lacking? He said, sell all your possessions, right, and follow me. And then the young rich ruler walks away, right? And he's sad. He walks away, and the Greek word I think is lupeo, which actually means he grieved, right? Because his love of money was so much, and he did everything else right. He just wasn't willing to give up that one thing, and that's his pursuit, right? And he was already off the rails there, right? And so keeping God as the center of it is the biggest guardrails you can put.
Yeah, and you spoke to time as well, right? Like time with your family, because somebody might be listening and they might be saying, I wish I could make 3 times what I make right now. I'll sacrifice the time, but in many ways you don't know what you're asking.
Nope.
Kind of like the rich young ruler is like, hey, do you really know what you're asking? Are you really trying to do this the right way? And Mark, you mentioned this before we got started a little bit, that because of what you were able to do and retire early, you're now able to invest time into the next generation and to teach part-time and things like that. But what are some other guardrails that you would put up, or maybe that you have seen in your life that maybe you've run up against or you've helped people overcome when it comes to building wealth? How can people do this in a healthy way?
Yes. So just adding to what Aman said, starting with a budget, it really all starts with a budget. You need to know where your money's going in order to have control over your finances. Another big thing is avoiding debt, because debt really sabotages your goals, right? Your future goals. You're saving for retirement. You're saving for a house, or whatever your goals are. And then the other thing is start saving as early as you can, because compound interest is a beautiful thing, right? And watch that grow. But all these tools and processes are good, but it's not rocket science, right? It's just basic stuff. The hard part is changing habits. The hard part is, how do I do this, right? How do I change my habit of perhaps overspending, or not really knowing where my money's going, or just buying things on a credit card continuously? That's the hardest part. So I would say, if you're starting out, start out small, okay? Start saving a little bit. Start building that habit. stop using your credit cards or not as much. Only get what you need for a period of time. Start building those habits, those good habits. And over time, you can build on that. You can start saving more. You can start, you can avoid debt and so forth.
Yeah. And Mark, you helped my wife and I, which we're forever grateful for that. You helped us, coach us in this, a lot of these areas. So both of you said, hey, start with a budget. Okay, I've got that. For somebody listening, I've got my budget. I know what I spend monthly. I know my wants. I know some of the needs. I know some of the areas where I can curb it a little bit. I have this debt. How do I get out of that so I can start about building? How do I just cover up that hole? Where would you say somebody start? What's the one thing that you would somebody could start with?
Well, if you're in debt, particularly high interest debt like credit card debt, you really need to get out of that debt as soon as possible because the credit card company is taking advantage of you. So however you can do that as quickly as possible. That could involve tightening up your budget a little bit, maybe trying to figure out how I can make more money, right? Whatever it is to direct your attention to paying down that debt, because it's so crippling.
Yeah.
Right. It just cripples your ability to build wealth. Yeah.
Aman, would you add anything to that?
I would. I think that you have to think about small victories, right? A lot of people have different kinds of debt, right? High interest debt is one. But, I think when you see a victory, let's say, hey, I've got $10,000 over here and I've got $500 over here. Well, knock out that $500 and get that victory because then it becomes a mindset. And a lot of times they call it the snowball effect and other things too. But I think that if you start to just get slowly one thing after another and then actually ask for help. There's so many people who get into debt who because of, and I've been there before too, my ego didn't want or let me ask for help until later.
Or shame, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a shame component to it. And I think that if you will allow somebody to help you or give you a pathway to do it or go see people like Mark who say, hey, look, let's set up a plan, right? I think that's the thing. There are plenty of people out there that will help you.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of programs out there that will help you to accelerate debt recovery.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of saying those words.
Yeah. Speaking of programs, I want to give some people a resource. You mentioned one earlier before we started recording that you do with your family. Can you mention that again for anybody listening? Like, how can I start with my kids so they don't make the same mistakes that I did?
Yeah. So my kids, I recently moved them. I had them before, but I moved them back to a company called Greenlight. They're only focused, well, they're doing some stuff for adults now too, but mostly focused on children. Where you can actually set up accounts for them. You can actually put in guardrails, right? So you don't want your kids to spend so much money online or whatever. You can actually set each one of those individual buckets. But they've recently allowed kids to start investing some of their money. So there's sections on how to talk to them about stocks and ETFs and funds. And,
Disney. That's the first one.
Well, I mean, it could be, right? I mean, they don't list Disney in there, but they list a lot of the major stocks and you can search for more. And I asked my 5-year-old, because he had a little bit of cash in there, I said, where do you want to go? And he said, Google. All right, well, we're going to start with Google. Well, that's
Smart
right.
kid.
Nothing wrong with that. My other daughter said Amazon. So it's, and the other one's Apple. So they all chose their own ones.
Really
like,
smart
well,
kids.
why do you choose these things? And I think that if you start them off little by little and say, all right, we're only going to buy a little bit today because the price may go down. And so the price goes down, what do? We're going to may buy a little bit more and average that cost down. So you have to teach those simple things because I was never taught that. I learned that in my 20s.
Yeah.
But if we can lay the foundation now at 5 and 10, 15, well, then that generational debt thing starts going away, right? And then they have the tools to be able to teach their kids.
Yeah. And speaking of habits and family, obviously both of you are following Jesus. And I want to end off our time with this last question. We're going to say the quiet part out loud. Sometimes we're afraid of talking about tithing when it comes to church and following Jesus, especially when people are new to this journey. What difference is tithing? And if anybody's unfamiliar, tithing is what we believe in giving your first 10% of whatever comes in back to God. And so what, in your journey of following Jesus, what has been your journey of tithing, and why would you say it's important for people? Because somebody might be listening and saying, oh, here they go. They're talking about money again. The church just wants a piece of my paycheck. But the reality, and there's so much deeper spiritual truths, Mark, what's been your journey with tithing? How's that changed? And then why would that be important for somebody else to follow?
Well, I started out not tithing at all. And I can remember growing up and my parents would put a couple bucks in the offering bucket. obviously much less than 10%. And that's kind of what I was familiar with. And so when I started going to Gateway, I wasn't tithing. And I can remember one Sunday early on, I took a $20 bill and I put it in the offering bucket. And I felt like I was giving my life away, $20.
Yeah.
And so I basically started small, and then I just kept growing that every year. I kept growing it. And to me, it's being obedient to the Lord. I think that's really important. That's what I try to do. And I think, and you know, when you get to a point where you have financial freedom, it gives you a lot of flexibility too, to even give more, right, than 10%. So, you know, it's a joy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Aman, what would you add to that?
I was very similar when I first started. When I became a Christ follower, I did not give. It took me a little time before I started doing it, and part of it was I don't know where this is going. I don't know how they're using it, you know. And it was
The skepticism.
It was right, and it finally I sat down and started going through it. And in Malachi it says, you know, bring the first 10% of your store, you know, bring it into the storehouses or whatever, and test me on this, right, and test me. And so I was like, all right, well, if we're going to have this relationship, God, where I can test you, I'm going to put it out there, right? So I'm going to start giving. And it wasn't 10%. I'll tell you that one. I think it's like 4% or something like that. I'll tell on myself. Mm-hmm. But slowly I started seeing, you know, that my relationship with God was changing, right? Mm. God doesn't need our money, right? He can do whatever he wants to do, and he can, his people will be served. The whole thing with it is that the hold that money had on me was starting to get let go because I was willing to let go, right? And so my idol was going away, and that's when I was like, all right, I can do 5%, I can do the 10%. And even to this day, I don't automate my giving, right? So every month, I'll go online and give, but the reason I do it is because every time I give, I want to pray, right? You know, with God on this. Yeah. There are missionaries we support also with our giving, because we've now gone above and beyond. And for every one of those, I don't automate that either. I'm like, what are you doing in their lives? How are they doing that? They're furthering your kingdom. So I like to be able to do that. And I think it's just building my relationship with God. Yeah. Like getting that out of the way has helped dramatically for me to have that relationship.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you guys so much. And I think for some of the resources that you guys mentioned, budget building, green light, and then another one that I would add is FPU, Financial Peace University, that we've got starting at our North Campus, South Campus in Buda, starting in late September now. And so if you don't know where to start there. And jumping into community and doing it with other people and know, okay, I'm not alone in this. I'm not the only one who feels like they're lost in the wilderness that is finances. So thank you guys so much for your time. We appreciate you, appreciate your journey, and thank you for helping the people that you're helping and continuing doing it.
Yeah,
appreciate you. Yeah.